Early life and royal beginnings. Cleopatra VII. Philopator was born in 69 BC into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a ruling family of Macedonian Greek origin that had held sway over Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great. Her early life unfolded in the vibrant and culturally diverse city of Alexandria, the Ptolemaic capital. This city was a center of learning and commerce, and Cleopatra's family ruled from the opulent royal palace that overlooked the Mediterranean Sea. Cleopatra's upbringing, though sheltered within the walls of the palace, was marked by a political environment of growing instability. Her father Ptolemy, X12, known as Ptolemaic, the flute player, had inherited a fragile kingdom. Egypt, despite its ancient glory, was now a shadow of its former self. Its economy was in decline, and its political independence was precariously balanced between the ambitions of its neighbors and the rising power of Rome. The Ptolemaic dynasty itself was also embroiled in internal conflict, and by the time of Cleopatra's birth, the once great family was weakened by infighting and questionable leadership. Ptolemy XII, like many of his predecessors, was more concerned with maintaining his personal wealth and luxurious lifestyle than ruling effectively. His reign was marked by heavy taxation and unpopular policies that created widespread dissatisfaction among the Egyptian populace. Unlike Cleopatra, Ptolemaic rulers generally maintained their Greek cultural identity and had little interest in learning the language or customs of their Egyptian subjects. However, Cleopatra VII would diverge from this tradition in ways that would define her rule and legacy. Despite these challenges, Cleopatra was given an exceptional education, as was customary for the children of royalty. The Ptolemaic court placed a high value on Greek education, and Cleopatra was tutored in a wide range of subjects. She learned Greek and was proficient in many other languages, reportedly speaking as many as 9, including Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Latin. This linguistic ability would serve her well in diplomacy and politics later in life, setting her apart from her predecessors who had largely ignored the Egyptian language and culture. Cleopatra's deep interest in Egyptian customs and religion was also unusual for a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty. While most of her forebears had ruled as foreign monarchs, Cleopatra sought to align herself with the traditions of the land she governed. She embraced the role of the living goddess Isis, a powerful symbol in Egyptian religion, and portrayed herself as the embodiment of this deity. This identification with Egyptian culture would help her build loyalty among the native Egyptian population, setting her up as a more legitimate ruler in their eyes than her Greek predecessors. As a child, Cleopatra would have witnessed the opulence of the Ptolemaic court, with its vast libraries, intricate palaces, and vibrant intellectual life. The famous Library of Alexandria, one of the largest libraries of the ancient world, was a central institution in the city, attracting scholars and thinkers from across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra likely grew up surrounded by the greatest minds of her time, including philosophers, scientists, and mathematicians. This intellectual environment shaped her sharp mind and prepared her for the political challenges that lay ahead. However, Cleopatra's early life was also shadowed by political turmoil. Ptolemy XII's unpopular rule made him vulnerable to both domestic unrest and external pressures in 58 BC, following a particularly unpopular decision to hand over Cyprus to Rome. Ptolemy was forced to flee Egypt. After a revolt, he sought refuge in Rome, leaving Cleopatra and her siblings in the hands of the rebels, and Cleopatra's older sister Berenice IV, who seized the throne in his absence. Baron's brief reign is a lesser-known chapter of the Ptolemaic saga, but it played a pivotal role in shaping Cleopatra's early political understanding. While Berenice ruled, she faced opposition from Roman interests and internal factions within Egypt, and her power was constantly under threat. Eventually, with Roman support, Ptolemy XII managed to regain his throne in 55 BC, leading to the execution of Berenice. This brutal act demonstrated the high stakes of Ptolemaic politics, where family loyalty was often sacrificed for power. Cleopatra, still a young teenager at the time, likely learned a valuable lesson about the ruthlessness required to survive in such a volatile political landscape after returning to power. Ptolemy XII reigned for a few more years, but his authority remained shaky. His relationship with Rome grew increasingly complicated, as Egypt became more dependent on Roman support to maintain its independence. The Roman Republic, led by powerful generals like Julius Caesar and Pompey, was expanding its influence. Across the Mediterranean and Egypt's wealth and strategic location made it an attractive prize. During these years, Cleopatra began to emerge as a key figure in the Ptolemaic court. As her father's health declined, she took on more responsibilities, preparing herself for the role. She would soon inherit Ptolemy. The 12's reign came to an end in 51 BCE, when he died, leaving his 18-year-old daughter Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII as co-rulers of Egypt. According to Ptolemaic tradition, the siblings were also required to marry to solidify their joint rule. Thus began Cleopatra's reign, one of the most complex and storied in ancient history from the outset. It was clear that she was no ordinary queen, unlike her brother, who was young and heavily influenced by his advisors. Cleopatra quickly established herself as the dominant figure in the government. She was ambitious, intelligent, and determined to assert her authority. But she faced immediate challenges. Egypt was deeply divided, with various factions vying for control, and the growing presence of Rome loomed large over the country's affairs. Cleopatra's early years as queen were marked by an intense struggle for power. She understood that her position was precarious and that she would have to fight to maintain her grip on the throne. Her relationship with her brother Ptolemy XIII became increasingly strained as his advisors, particularly the powerful eunuch Pothos, sought to undermine Cleopatra's authority. Panis and his faction resented Cleopatra's independence and her attempts to rule without interference, and they conspired to drive her from power by 49 BCE. Cleopatra had been forced to flee Alexandria as tensions between her and her brother, his supporters, boiled over into open conflict. She sought refuge in the eastern desert, where she began raising an army to reclaim her throne. Cleopatra's decision to wage war against her brother demonstrated not only her determination, but also her understanding of the political dynamics of the time. She knew that she needed a powerful ally to succeed, and she found that ally in Julius Caesar, the Roman general who was rapidly becoming one of the most influential figures in the Mediterranean. The year 48 BCE would prove to be a turning point in Cleopatra's life. Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt following his victory over Pompey in the Roman Civil War. Pompey had sought refuge in Egypt, but he was betrayed and murdered by Ptolemy XIII's advisors in an attempt to win favor with Caesar. However, this move backfired, as Caesar was outraged by the killing of a fellow Roman, and he soon found himself entangled in the dynastic conflict between Cleopatra and her brother. Cleopatra seized this opportunity to align herself with Caesar. According to legend, she famously had herself smuggled into his quarters, rolled up in a carpet or possibly a linen sack to meet him in person. This bold and dramatic gesture not only captured Caesar's attention, but also set the stage for one of the most famous alliances in history. Cleopatra's intelligence, wit, and charm impressed Caesar, and he quickly decided to support her claim to the throne. With Caesar's backing, Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, where a brutal civil war between her forces and those of Ptolemy XIII ensued. The conflict culminated in the siege of Alexandria, during which the city's great library was partially destroyed. In the end, Cleopatra emerged victorious, and Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while trying to flee the battlefield. Cleopatra was now the undisputed ruler of Egypt, though she still had to share power with her younger brother, Ptolemy. XIV, whom she married according to Ptolemaic custom, however. Cleopatra was the true ruler in all but name, and her alliance with Julius Caesar would soon catapult her to the center of Roman politics. Part 2. The struggle for the throne after the dramatic victory over her brother Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra VII solidified her position as Queen of Egypt. However, her reign was far from secure. The internal power struggles of the Ptolemaic dynasty, combined with the ever-growing Roman presence in Egypt, made her throne unstable. The murder of her brother was not the end of the challenges she faced, but merely the beginning of a turbulent period marked by political intrigue, strategic alliances, and the struggle to maintain control over her kingdom. When Cleopatra returned to Alexandria following her victory, she resumed the co-rule with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV. He was still a child, and Cleopatra wasted no time in asserting her dominance. The power was hers, although she had to adhere to the symbolic sharing of authority to appease her subjects and Roman backers. In reality, Cleopatra was the one making all decisions for Egypt, using her intelligence and political acumen to navigate the complex web of Egyptian court politics and Rome's ambitions in the region. Cleopatra's consolidation of power was marked by her desire to restore Egypt to its former glory. She inherited a kingdom that had seen years of decline under her father, Ptolemy XII, whose corrupt rule and reliance on Roman support had drained the state's finances and weakened its internal structure. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's strength lay not just in its rich resources, but also in its strategic importance to the Roman Republic. She knew that aligning with Rome's most powerful figures could help protect her kingdom, while simultaneously giving her access to influence beyond Egypt's borders. At this point, Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar deepened, both personally and politically. Their romantic liaison was widely known, but it was the political alliance that shaped the future of Egypt and Cleopatra's reign. Caesar had left Egypt shortly after Ptolemy XIII's defeat to deal with other matters in the Roman Civil War, but he returned to Alexandria to spend time with Cleopatra. During this time, Cleopatra gave birth to her son Ptolemy Caesar, more commonly known as Caesarion. His birth in 47 BCE was a turning point for Cleopatra, as it gave her a legitimate heir, one she believed would one day rule both Egypt and Rome. Caesarian birth further cemented the political alliance between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. But it also brought new challenges in Rome. Caesar's political opponents viewed his relationship with Cleopatra and the birth of Caesarion with suspicion. Many Romans, including those in the Senate, saw Cleopatra as a foreign queen who had too much influence over their leader. The prospect of Caesarion being named Caesar's heir, which would have made him a ruler of both Rome and Egypt, was especially troubling to the Roman elite, who feared the heir of traditional Roman republicanism in favor of monarchy in Egypt. However, Cleopatra took steps to strengthen her position and enhance her legacy. She adopted the title of Philippa, or goddess, who loves her father, aligning herself with the deified tradition of Ptolemaic rulers. Cleopatra was keenly aware of the power of religious imagery, and she worked to present herself as the embodiment of Isis, the mother goddess of Egypt. This alignment with Isis was a strategic move that appealed to both the Egyptian population and the religious elite, who saw Cleopatra as a protector of Egypt's heritage and traditions. Despite the growing bond between Cleopatra and Caesar, Rome's internal politics posed a continual threat to her reign. Caesar was forced to return to Rome in 47 BC to address his political and military challenges, leaving Cleopatra to rule Egypt on her own once more. During this time, she focused on stabilizing Egypt's economy, which had suffered under her father's reign. She also worked to strengthen Egypt's trade routes, particularly its lucrative grain exports to Rome. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's wealth lay in its agricultural output, particularly the grain that fed much of the Mediterranean back in Rome. Caesar's position was becoming more precarious. In 44 BC, tensions reached their peak when he was assassinated on the Ides of March by a group of Roman senators, including his former allies Brutus and Cassius. The murder of Caesar sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world and had profound implications for Cleopatra, with her strongest ally. Dead Cleopatra, his position became vulnerable once again. Caesarion, the child she had hoped would one day inherit Caesar, his legacy was now seen as a potential threat by the new power brokers in Rome. Cleopatra's initial reaction to Caesar's assassination was one of caution. She knew that her fate and that of Egypt depended on how the new Roman leadership would view her, and her son Caesar's death plunged Rome into a new round of civil war as his supporters, led by Mark Antony and Octavian later. Augustus sought to avenge his assassination and seize control of the Republic. Cleopatra carefully navigated this uncertain political landscape, biding her time and waiting to see which faction would emerge victorious. In the meantime, Cleopatra solidified her rule in Egypt by eliminating potential threats within her own court. She had her brother Ptolemy XIV poisoned in 44 BC, thereby removing him from power and leaving herself as the sole ruler of Egypt. To further legitimize her rule, Cleopatra made her son Caesar and her co-regent. Although she remained the true authority in the kingdom, Cleopatra's actions during this time illustrate her ruthlessness and determination to protect her position at all costs. She had learned from her father's mistakes and from the volatile political environment of the Ptolemaic court that survival required both cunning and decisiveness. As the Roman civil war between Mark Antony, Octavian, and the conspirators who had killed Caesar unfolded, Cleopatra's future remained uncertain. Egypt, though officially independent, was deeply unshed in Roman politics, and Cleopatra knew that the outcome of this conflict would determine the fate of her kingdom. Her relationship with Rome had shifted from her early alliance with Caesar, and now she found herself navigating a dangerous path, unsure of which side would prevail. Cleopatra was also aware that her personal relationship with Caesar had made her a target for criticism and suspicion among Rome's political elite. Rumors circulated about her ambitions and her influence over Roman led ERS painting her as a manipulative foreign queen who sought to dominate Rome through seduction and intrigue. Cleopatra's reputation was being shaped not just by her actions but by the perceptions and propaganda of the Roman world as she prepared to enter into a new phase of her political life. Cleopatra knew that she would have to be more careful than ever. By the time of Caesar's death, Cleopatra had already established herself as a powerful and capable ruler. She had consolidated her position in Egypt, restored some of the country's economic stability, and forged critical alliances with the Roman Republic. Yet with the shifting sands of Roman politics and the rise of new power players like Mark Antony and Octavian, Cleopatra's fate was far from secure. As the Roman civil war intensified, Cleopatra would once again find herself drawn into the heart of the conflict, forging new alliances in an effort to protect her kingdom and secure her son. As future Cleopatra's struggle for the throne of Egypt was defined by her ability to navigate both the internal divisions of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the external pressures of Roman expansion. Through her intelligence, political savvy, and willingness to make bold moves, she managed to maintain control of Egypt during one of the most tumultuous periods in its history. Yet the death of Julius Caesar marked a turning point in her reign, one that would force her to seek new allies and confront new enemies in her ongoing fight for survival. As Cleopatra's story continued, her alliance with Mark Antony would prove to be both a source of strength and ultimately her downfall. But in these early years, Cleopatra demonstrated the qualities that would define her: reign, resilience, ambition, and an unwavering commitment to securing Egypt, his place in a rapidly changing world. The struggle for the throne was only the beginning of her journey, one that would lead her into the heart of Roman politics and cement her place in history as one of the most iconic rulers of the ancient world. Part 3: Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. By the time Cleopatra aligned herself with Julius Caesar in 48 BCEE, she had already experienced the complexities and dangers of ruling as the Queen of Egypt. The dramatic events leading to their meeting, the murder of her brother Ptolemy XIII, the internal strife in the Ptolemaic court, and Cleopatra's forced exile had tested her resolve. Cleopatra knew that her future, as well as that of Egypt, depended on forging strong alliances with Rome. The rising power of the Mediterranean world, her calculated relationship with Julius Caesar, was not only a strategic move, but also a defining moment in both of their legacies. When Cleopatra smuggled herself into Caesar's quarters, famously rolled in a carpet or possibly a linen sack, it was an act of audacity. Cleopatra understood the importance of spectacle and knew that this dramatic gesture would capture Caesar's attention in many ways. This event symbolizes the beginning of Cleopatra's relationship with one of the most powerful men in history, a relationship that would intertwine Egyptian and Roman politics in ways that would shape the destiny of both empires. Cleopatra and Caesar's alliance was rooted in mutual benefit for Cleopatra. Caesar represented a powerful ally who could help her solidify her rule and protect Egypt from external threats, particularly from the growing influence of Rome. For Caesar, Cleopatra was not only an exotic and intriguing figure, but also the ruler of a strategically vital kingdom. Egypt's grain was essential to feeding the Roman population, and its wealth could provide valuable resources for Caesar's ambitions. Back in Rome together, they formed a political and romantic partnership that had far-reaching consequences. Julius Caesar was a man of immense ambition, and by the time he encountered Cleopatra, he was already engaged in a civil war with his rival. Pompey Caesar had followed Pompey to Egypt, where the latter had sought refuge after his defeat at the Battle of Philus. However, Ptolemy XIII's advisor, in an attempt to curry favor with Caesar, had Pompey assassinated. This act of betrayal angered Caesar, who saw it as an affront to Roman dignity. Despite his enmity with Pompey, when Caesar arrived in Alexandria, Egypt became a battleground. For both Roman and Egyptian interests, Cleopatra, recognizing that Caesar's influence could be the key to reclaiming her throne, sought him out. The famous meeting between the two has been romanticized over the centuries, but in reality, it was likely a highly calculated move on Cleopatra's part. Caesar, impressed by her intelligence, wit, and political acumen, decided to support her claim to the throne. This decision set off a civil war between Cleopatra's forces and those of her brother Ptolemy XIII, culminating in the siege of Alexandria. The siege was a pivotal moment in Cleopatra's reign. Caesar's presence in Egypt had intensified the political stakes, and the battle for control of Alexandria would determine the future of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The conflict was fierce, with much of the city caught in the crossfire. During the siege, a portion of the great library of Alexandria was destroyed, a cultural loss that would be felt for centuries. Despite the destruction, Cleopatra emerged victorious, and Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while attempting to flee the battle. Cleopatra's other sibling, Arino, was captured and sent to Rome as part of Caesar's triumph, further solidifying Cleopatra's control over Egypt. With brother gone, Cleopatra was reinstalled as the sole ruler of Egypt, though she nominally co-ruled with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, whom she married as part of Ptolemaic custom. However, Cleopatra held all the real power. Her alliance with Caesar not only secured her throne, but also opened the door to a new phase in her Reign one that would bring Egypt even closer to the Roman world. The relationship between Cleopatra and Caesar was more than a simple political ICAL alliance. Cleopatra soon became pregnant, and in 47 BC, she gave birth to a son, Ptolemy Caesar, more commonly known as Caesarian Cleopatra. Hopes for her son were grand. She saw him as the future ruler of both Egypt and Rome, a symbol of the union between the two great powers of the Mediterranean. Caesar, too, acknowledged the boy as his son, though Roman politics made it impossible for him to publicly declare Caesarion his heir. Cleopatra's time with Caesar in Alexandria was not just about consolidating her power, it was also a time of great personal and political growth. For her, she and Caesar spent months together discussing philosophy, governance, and strategy. Cleopatra, already a well-educated and politically astute ruler, absorbed much from Caesar's vast experience as a military commander and statesman. The influence of Rome's political culture began to seep into her rule, and Cleopatra began to think of herself not just as the Queen of Egypt, but as a key player in the broader Roman world in 46 BCE. Cleopatra accompanied Caesar to Rome, an event that caused a sensation in the city. Cleopatra's presence in Rome was a bold statement. Of her ambitions and her relationship with Caesar, she lived in Caesar's villa outside the city, and her arrival was marked by grand processions and lavish displays of wealth. Cleopatra, always conscious of her image, presented herself as a living goddess, the embodiment of Isis, complete with royal regalia and divine iconography. This display was as much for the Roman elite as it was for her own subjects, signaling her status as not just a foreign queen, but a ruler with divine authority. However, Cleopatra's time in Rome was not without controversy. Many Romans viewed her with suspicion, seeing her as a foreign influence over Caesar, whose ambitions for power were already causing alarm among the Roman Senate. Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar was used as fuel by his political enemies, who sought to portray him as being seduced by an Eastern queen. The birth of Caesarion added another layer of intrigue as rumors circulated that Caesar intended to make Cleopatra's son his heir, bypassing his grandnephew Octavian, who would later become Augustus. The Roman public's reaction to Cleopatra was mixed. While some were captivated by her beauty, intelligence, and wealth, others saw her as a threat to Roman values and traditions. Cleopatra's association with divine royalty clashed with the Roman Republic's ideals of civic virtue and shared governance. Her exoticism and her role as a monarch were alien to Roman sensibilities, and her influence over Caesar was seen by many as a dangerous precedent. Despite the controversy, Cleopatra remained in Rome for 2 years, during which time she deepened her understanding of Roman politics and forged new connections with key figures in Caesar's administration. Her presence in Rome was also a statement to the wider Mediterranean world. Cleopatra was not just the queen of a declining Egyptian kingdom, but a major player in the geopolitical affairs of the time. She used this opportunity to build alliances and secure Egypt's position as an indispensable partner to Rome in March of 44 BCE. However, Cleopatra's fortunes shifted dramatically. Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of Roman senators, including Brutus, and cases in a brutal and well-coordinated attack during a Senate meeting. The murder of Caesar plunged Rome into chaos, and Cleopatra found herself in a perilous position with her strongest ally gone. Cleopatra had to navigate the complex and dangerous political landscape that followed Caesar's death. Cleopatra's immediate concern was for her son Caesarion, whom she believed to be the rightful heir to Caesar's legacy. However, the political situation in Rome was too unstable for Cleopatra to make any bold claims. The assassins of Caesar had expected to restore the Republic, but instead Rome descended into civil war as Caesar's supporters, including Mark Antony and Octavian, sought to avenge his death and seize control of the Republic, fearing for her safety and the future of her son. Cleopatra quietly left Rome and returned to Egypt back in Alexandria. She worked to stabilize her kingdom, which had been left vulnerable by the shifting tides of Roman politics. Cleopatra understood that her survival depended on aligning herself with the new power players in Rome, but she also knew that Egypt's independence was at stake. The years that followed would see Cleopatra form a new alliance with Mark Antony, but her time with Julius Caesar had already cemented her place in history. Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar was not just a romantic liaison, it was a pivotal political alliance that reshaped the dynamics of power in the Mediterranean. The birth of Caesarion symbolized Cleopatra's vision of a united Egypt and Rome, a vision that would drive her ambitions for the rest of her reign. Part 4. The birth of Caesarion and Cleopatra's ambitions. Following her return to Egypt after Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra VII found herself in a precarious but pivotal position. The death of Caesar was a major blow to her political aspirations, as he had been both a powerful ally and the father of a son, Ptolemy Caesar, better known as Caesarion. However, Cleopatra's ambitions were far from diminished. Her focus now turned to her son, whom she believed could one day fulfill the dream of uniting Egypt and Rome under a single rule. Caesarion was born in 47 BCE during Cleopatra and Caesar's time together in Egypt. From the moment of his birth, Cleopatra saw him as the embodiment of a political future, a symbol of her union with Caesar and the potential for a new era of power in the Mediterranean. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, asserting his dual heritage as both a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the son of Rome's most powerful leader. In Egyptian tradition, he was also referred to as Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar, a name that emphasized his connection to the Roman leader. The birth of Caesarion was a significant event, not only for Cleopatra, but for the broader political landscape. Cleopatra had hoped that Caesar would formally recognize their son as his heir, which would have positioned Caesarion as a potential ruler of both Egypt and Rome. However, Roman law and tradition complicated this possibility. Although Caesar acknowledged Caesarion as his son privately, he never publicly declared him his heir, likely due to the complexities of Roman succession and the existence of his grandnephew Octavian, who would later become Augustus. Despite the uncertainty surrounding Caesarion's status in Rome, Cleopatra made it clear that she viewed her son as the legitimate successor to both the Egyptian and Roman thrones in Egypt. Caesarion was celebrated as a divine figure, the son of Cleopatra, who presented herself as the embodiment of the goddess Isis, and Julius Caesar, who was increasingly venerated as a godlike figure in Rome. Cleopatra used religious symbolism to elevate Caesarion's status, portraying him as a child of destiny who would one day inherit the leadership of the two greatest powers in the ancient world. Cleopatra's ambitions for Caesarion went hand in and with her efforts to strengthen Egypt's position in the Mediterranean. After seeing Caesar's death, his political future became even more uncertain. The Roman Republic was in turmoil, with Caesar's assassination leading to a new round of civil wars between his supporters and those who sought to restore the old Roman order. Cleopatra, always astute in her political calculations, knew that Egypt's independence would depend on navigating these conflicts and securing new alliances in the immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination. Cleopatra had to be cautious. The Roman world was divided between those who supported Caesar's legacy and those who opposed it. and Cleopatra needed to determine which side would ultimately prevail. She did not rush to involve herself in the Roman civil war, but instead focused on consolidating her power in Egypt and ensuring that her son would be positioned as the future leader of her kingdom. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra embarked on a series of reforms and public works projects designed to stabilize the Egyptian economy and demonstrate her capacity to rule effectively. Egypt's wealth was derived primarily from its agricultural output, particularly its vast grain fields along the Nile, which fed much of the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra's predecessors had left the kingdom in a state of economic decline, but under her leadership, Egypt began to recover. She improved irrigation systems, reformed the tax structure, and fostered trade relationships with other Mediterranean powers. Cleopatra. His efforts were not only practical but also political. By restoring Egypt, its economic strength, she sought to increase her kingdom's importance to Rome. The grain produced by Egypt was essential to feeding the Roman population, and understood that this economic leverage could be used to protect Egypt's independence. Moreover, she positioned Egypt as a stable and prosperous state amid the chaos of the Roman civil wars, making herself an indispensable ally to whichever faction emerged victorious throughout this period. Cleopatra continued to present herself as a divine ruler, a living goddess who embodied both Egyptian and Hellenistic traditions. Her identification with the goddess Isis was particularly significant. In Egyptian mythology, Isis was the mother of Horus, the god-king who ruled over the heavens and the earth. By aligning herself with Cleopatra, not only reinforced her own legitimacy, but also cast Caesarion in the role of Horus, the rightful heir to the throne. This religious imagery resonated with the Egyptian population, many of whom saw Cleopatra as a protector of their cultural heritage in the face of Roman domination. Despite her focus on domestic affairs, Cleopatra was acutely aware that Egypt's fate was tied to the outcome of the Roman civil wars in 42 B. So the tide of Roman politics shifted decisively when the forces of Mark Antony and Octavian, both of whom were loyal to Caesar, defeated the army of Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi. This victory marked the beginning of a new political order in Rome, with Mark Antony controlling the eastern provinces and Octavian consolidating power in the west. Cleopatra had met Mark Antony during her time in Rome with Caesar, but their relationship at that time had been purely formal now. However, with Antony in control of Rome, his eastern territories, including Egypt, Cleopatra saw an opportunity to forge a new alliance. Antony, like Caesar, was a charismatic and ambitious leader, and Cleopatra knew that he would be a valuable partner in securing Egypt's future. Moreover, Antony needed Cleopatra's support. Egypt's wealth, particularly its grain supply, was crucial to maintaining the Roman armies in the east, and Cleopatra's political influence could help him solidify his position in the region. In 41, Cleopatra was summoned to Tarsus, a city in present-day Turkey, to meet with Mark Antony. Antony, like many Romans, had heard rumors of Cleopatra's beauty, intelligence, and political savvy, and he was eager to meet her in person. Cleopatra, ever the master of presentation, arrived in Tarsus in a magnificent procession. According to ancient sources, she sailed up the river Cydus on a gilded barge with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. Her attendant, dressed as Cupid, surrounded her, and the entire scene was designed to impress Antony and reinforce Cleopatra's image as a divine ruler. The meeting between Cleopatra and Antony was the beginning of one of history's most famous political and romantic alliances. Antony, captivated by Cleopatra's charm and intelligence, quickly recognized the potential benefits of aligning himself with the Queen of Egypt. Cleopatra, for her part, saw Antony as a powerful ally who could protect her kingdom from Roman domination and ensure Caesarian future as her successor. The two leaders struck up a personal and political relationship that would define the next phase of Cleopatra's reign, Cleopatra's ambitions. For Caesarion was central to her alliance with Antony. She believed that with Antony's support, she could secure Egypt's independence and establish Caesarion as a legitimate ruler, not only in Egypt, but also in Rome. Antony, who had his own designs on expanding his power in the East, was more than willing to support Cleopatra's vision. Together, they envisioned a future where Egypt would play a dominant role in the Mediterranean world, with Caesarion as the heir to both Egyptian and Roman legacies. The birth of Caesarion marked a turning point in Cleopatra's political strategy. No longer content to rule as a mere queen, Cleopatra now saw herself as the mother of a future dynasty that would unite Egypt and Rome. Her ambitions for Caesarion extended beyond the borders of Egypt as she sought to position him as the rightful heir to Julius Caesar's legacy and a potential ruler of Rome. This vision would drive Cleopatra's actions for the remainder of her reign as she navigated the shifting alliances and conflicts of the Ran world. However, Cleopatra's ambitions for Caesarion would also make her a target as Rome. The civil wars continued. Octavian Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son emerged as a formidable rival to both Antony and Cleopatra. Octavian's rise to power would ultimately force Cleopatra into a final confrontation with Rome, one that would determine not only the fate of her kingdom, but also the future of Caesarion. Part 5. Cleopatra returned to Egypt after Julius Caesar's assassination in 44. Cleopatra VII found herself navigating a world of uncertainty. She had returned to Egypt, where she focused on consolidating her power and ensuring her son Caesarion's future as her co-ruler and heir. However, the Roman world was in turmoil, and Cleopatra's position as Queen of Egypt was far from secure. The death of her Roman protector meant that Cleopatra needed to be more vigilant than ever, as her ambitions for Egypt and for Caesarion relied heavily on the support of Roman power. Cleopatra returned to Egypt at a time when the country was still recovering from years of internal conflict and economic decline. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had left the kingdom in a precarious state, and Cleopatra's early years as queen had been marked by civil war. With her brother Ptolemy XIII now, with Caesar dead and Rome engulfed in a new round of civil wars, Cleopatra's focus shifted to stabilizing Egypt and restoring its position as a major power in the Mediterranean. One of Cleopatra's first moves upon her return to Egypt was to eliminate any potential threats to her rule. She had already secured her throne by having her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, poisoned shortly after Caesar's death. By doing so, she ensured that she would rule alone with Caesarion as her co-regent. This was a strategic decision on Cleopatra's part, as it allowed her to concentrate power in her own hands and remove any internal rivals who might challenge her authority. With her domestic position secured, Cleopatra turned her attention to Egypt's economy, which had suffered greatly during the previous decades of Ptolemaic mismanagement. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's wealth was its greatest asset, and she worked to revitalize the country's agriculture and trade. The Nile River was the lifeblood of Egypt's economy, and Cleopatra oversaw improvements to the irrigation systems that fed the kingdom's vast grain fields. By increasing agricultural output, Cleopatra ensured that Egypt could continue to export grain to Rome, a crucial source of revenue and political leverage. Cleopatra also sought to expand Egypt's trade networks, particularly with the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Egypt, a strategic location at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe, made it a hub for commerce, and Cleopatra capitalized on this by fostering relationships with neighboring states and trading partners. Under her rule, Egypt's ports were bustling with activity, and the kingdom's wealth began to grow once more as part of her efforts to restore Egypt's prestige. Cleopatra embarked on an ambitious program of public works and building projects. She commissioned new temples, monuments, and public buildings, many of which were dedicated to the gods of both the Egyptian and Greek pantheons, was its greatest asset. And she worked to revitalize the country as agriculture and trade. The Nile River was the lifeblood of Egypt's economy, and Cleopatra oversaw improvements to the irrigation systems that fed the kingdom's vast grain fields by increasing agricultural output. Cleopatra ensured that Egypt could continue to export grain to Rome, a crucial source of revenue and political leverage. Cleopatra also sought to expand Egypt's trade networks, particularly with the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Egypt's strategic location at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe made it a hub for commerce, and Cleopatra capitalized on this by fostering relationships with neighboring states and trading partners under her rule. Egypt's ports were bustling with activity, and the kingdom's wealth began to grow once more as part of her efforts to restore Egypt's prestige. Cleopatra embarked on an ambitious program of public works and building projects. She commissioned new temples, monuments, and public buildings, many of which were dedicated to the gods of both the Egyptian and Greek pantheons. Cleopatra was acutely aware of the importance of religious symbolism in maintaining her authority, and she continued to present herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. This association with Isis not only strengthened her legitimacy in the eyes of the Egyptian population, but also helped her cultivate an image of divine authority that set her apart from other rulers. Cleopatra's public works projects were not just about religious devotion. They were also a demonstration of her power and wealth by investing in grand structures and public amenities. Cleopatra showed both her own people and the wider Mediterranean world that Egypt was still a powerful and prosperous kingdom. Alexandria, the capital of Egypt and the seat of the Ptolemaic dynasty, became one of the most impressive cities of the ancient world. Under Cleopatra's reign, its great library, which had been partially destroyed during the earlier civil war, was restored, and the city's cultural and intellectual life flourished. Despite her focus on domestic affairs, Cleopatra remained deeply involved in the political developments unfolding in Rome. The power struggle between Mark Antony Octavian and the remnants of the faction that had assassinated Caesar was shaping the future of the Roman Republic, and Cleopatra knew that Egypt's fate was tied to the outcome of this conflict. Her relationship with Julius Caesar had given her a deep understanding of Roman politics, and she recognized that aligning herself with the right Roman faction would be key to securing Egypt's independence. In 42, Cleopatra's attention was drawn once again to the Roman Civil War as the forces of Mark Antony and Octavian clashed with those of Brutus and Caesar, the leaders of Caesar's assassins. The decisive Battle of Philippi saw the defeat of Brutus and Caesar, and with their victory, Antony and Octavian became the two most powerful figures in the Roman world. This victory had significant implications for Cleopatra, as it meant that the Roman Republic was now firmly in the hands of Caesar. As loyalists, Cleopatra had met Mark Antony during her time in Rome with Caesar, but their relationship had been purely diplomatic at that point now, with Antony controlling Rome's eastern provinces, including Egypt. Cleopatra saw an opportunity to forge a new alliance. Antony, for his part, was eager to secure the loyalty of Egypt, a wealthy and strategically important kingdom that could provide him with the resources he needed to solidify his power in the East. In the aftermath of the Battle of Philippi, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, a city in the Roman province of Sicily, modern-day Turkey. Cleopatra, always a master of political theater, made her entrance in grand fashion. According to the historian Plutarch, Cleopatra sailed up the Cydnus River in a gilded barge with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. Her attendant were dressed as cupids, and the entire scene was designed to dazzle Antony and reinforce Cleopatra's image as a divine ruler. Antony, who was known for his love of luxury and spectacle, was captivated by Cleopatra's charm, intelligence, and beauty. The two quickly struck up a personal and political relationship that would shape the next chapter of Atra's reign. Cleopatra saw Antony as a powerful ally who could protect Egypt from Roman domination and support her ambitions for Caesarion, while Antony saw Cleopatra as a valuable partner in his quest to control the eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra's return to Egypt after her meeting with Antony marked the beginning of a new phase in her reign. With Antony's support, she felt more secure in her position and more confident in her ability to navigate the dangerous waters of Rome politics. Antony, who was preparing to wage a new campaign in Parthia, needed Egypt's wealth and resources to fund his military ambitions, and Cleopatra was more than willing to provide them in exchange for his political backing. At this point, Cleopatra's ambitions for Caesar Iron were central to her political strategy. She believed that with Antony's support, she could not only secure Egypt's independence, but also position Caesarion as a legitimate ruler in both Egypt and Rome. Cleopatra's vision for her son extended beyond the borders of Egypt as she sought to establish him as a figure of imperial significance in the broader Mediterranean world. Antony, who had his own designs on expanding his power in the East, was more than willing to support Cleopatra's ambitions as long as they aligned with his own during the years that followed. Cleopatra and Antony deepened their alliance both personally and politically. Antony spent much of his time in Alexandria, where he and Cleopatra enjoyed a lavish and luxurious lifestyle. The two were inseparable, and their relationship became the subject of gossip and intrigue throughout the Roman world. For Cleopatra, this was a golden age of her reign. With Antony by her side, she felt more secure than ever, and Egypt's wealth and influence continued to grow, however. Cleopatra's return to Egypt and her relationship with Antony also set the stage for her eventual downfall, while Cleopatra was focused on strengthening her position in the East. Octavian was consolidating his power in the West. The alliance between Antony and Cleopatra would soon come into conflict with Octavian's ambitions, and the rivalry between Antony and Octavian would lead to one of the most dramatic confrontations in ancient history, the Battle of Actium. But for now, Cleopatra's return to Egypt marked a period of relative stability and prosperity. Her political acumen, coupled with her ability to forge powerful alliances, allowed her to maintain control over her kingdom and pursue her ambitions for Caesarion. Cleopatra's reign during these years was characterized by a delicate balance of diplomacy, economic reform, and cultural patronage, all of which helped to secure Egypt's place as a major power in the Mediterranean. As Cleopatra looked to the future, she knew that the challenges ahead would be daunting. The Roman world was in flux, and her relationship with Antony, while providing immediate benefits, also exposed her to new risks. Nevertheless, Cleopatra remained determined to protect her kingdom and her son's future. Even as the political winds of Rome shifted around her, Part 6, Cleopatra and Mark Antony, by 41. Cleopatra was at the height of her power, ruling Egypt with a firm hand and securing her kingdom's future. With careful diplomacy and alliances, her meeting with Mark Antony in Tarsus that year was a defining moment in her reign, marking the beginning of one of the most famous political and romantic alliances in history. Cleopatra and Antony's relationship would soon change the course of the ancient world, drawing Egypt further into the turmoil of Roman politics and setting the stage for confrontation with Rome's future emperor Octavian. Cleopatra and Antony were an unlikely pairing. In many ways, Antony, a Roman general known for his charisma and love of luxury, had been a loyal supporter of Julius Caesar. He was one of Caesar's key allies in the years leading up to his assassination, and after Caesar's death, Antony became one of the three men who formed the Second Triumph, a ruling alliance that divided control of the Roman Republic between himself, Octavian, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Antony's domain included the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, making his alliance with Egypt and Cleopatra particularly important for Cleopatra. Aligning with Antony offered a means of securing Egypt's independence. In the face of growing Roman influence, she had witnessed the destructive power of Roman politics firsthand during her time with Julius Caesar, and she knew that her kingdom's survival depended on maintaining a strong alliance with the dominant forces in Rome. Antony, with his control over the eastern provinces and his ambitions for expansion, was the perfect ally. But their relationship was not purely political. Antony, captivated by Cleopatra's intelligence, wit, and charm, quickly fell in love with the Egyptian queen. Cleopatra's arrival in Tarsus to meet Antony was a spectacle carefully designed to impress the Roman general Plutarch. The ancient historian recounts how Cleopatra sailed up the Cydus River on a gilded barge with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. Her attendants, similarly dressed as Cupids, fanned her as the boat glided through the water. This display was more than just a show of wealth and grandeur. It was a calculated assertion of Cleopatra's divine status and her right to rule. Antony, known for his love of excess and grandeur, was captivated by Cleopatra's display, and their relationship was quickly cemented following their meeting in Tarsus. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, where they spent the next several months together. Alexandria, the capital of Egypt, was one of the most vibrant and cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world, and Cleopatra's court was a hub of intellectual and cultural life. The city's famous Library of Alexandria had been partially restored after the earlier civil war, and its scholars continued to be among the most renowned in the Mediterranean. Cleopatra's reign had brought a new era of prosperity to the city, and Antony found himself drawn into its luxurious and sophisticated atmosphere. For Cleopatra, her relationship with Antony represented both personal and political opportunity. Antony's support would help secure her position as queen and ensure that her son Caesarion was recognized as her legitimate heir. Cleopatra had grand ambitions for Caesarion, whom she saw not only as the future ruler of Egypt, but also as a potential heir to Julius Caesar. His legacy with Antony by her side, Cleopatra believed she could protect Egypt's independence and position her son as a central figure in both Egyptian and Roman politics. Antony, too, had much to gain from his relationship with Cleopatra. Egypt was one of the wealthiest and most strategically important regions in the Mediterranean, and Antony needed Cleopatra's resources to fund his military campaigns at the time. Antony was preparing for a major campaign against the Parthians, a powerful empire to the east of Rome, and Egypt's grain, gold, and naval power would be essential to his success. In exchange for Cleopatra's support, Antony granted her control over several Roman territories, including parts of modern-day Lebanon, Syria, and Cyprus. These gifts significantly expanded Cleopatra's kingdom and increased her influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. The relationship between Cleopatra and Antony was not without its challenges in Rome. Antony's alliance with Cleopatra was viewed with suspicion and hostility. Many Romans saw Cleopatra as a manipulative foreign queen who had bewitched Antony and was leading him away from his Roman duties. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing centuries later, reflected the biases of the time by describing Cleopatra as a cunning and dangerous woman who used her beauty to seduce Antony and further her own ambitions. These views were fueled by Octavian's propaganda, which painted Antony as a traitor to Rome who had abandoned his Roman wife Octavia Octavian's sister for the Egyptian queen. In truth, Cleopatra's relationship with Antony was far more complex than Roman propaganda suggested. Both leaders were experienced politicians who understood the importance of their alliance. Cleopatra needed Antony's military and political support to maintain her position in Egypt, while Antony needed Cleopatra's wealth and resources to further his own ambitions. In the East, their relationship was one of mutual benefit, with each partner bringing something essential to the table. Cleopatra and Antony's partnership was also deeply personal. The two spent long periods of time together in Alexandria, where they lived in luxury and splendor. According to Plutarch, they formed a private society called the Inimitable Livers, a group of friends and courtiers who spent their days feasting, drinking, and enjoying the pleasures of life. Antony, who had always been known for his love of In the Eastern Mediterranean, the donations of Alexandria were a bold move, one that sent shockwaves through the Roman world. By declaring Caesarion as Julius Caesar's heir, Antony openly challenged Octavian's position as Caesar's adopted son and heir in Rome. This declaration was a direct threat to Octavian's power, and it set the stage for the final showdown between Antony, Cleopatra, and Octavian back in Rome. Octavian seized on the donations of Alexandria to further his propaganda campaign against Antony and Cleopatra. He portrayed Antony as a man who had fallen under the spell of a foreign queen, abandoning his Roman duties and ambitions in favor of living a life of luxury in Egypt. Octavian's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to depict Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress who sought to undermine in Rome and establish her own dynasty. These depictions played on Roman fears of foreign influence and the idea that Antony had become Egyptianizing his back on Roman values. The tensions between Antony and Octavian continued to grow, and by 32 BCE, it was clear that a final confrontation was inevitable. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, prepared for the coming conflict by building up Egypt's navy and strengthening her defenses. She knew that Antony's fortunes were tied to hers and that the outcome of the war would determine not only her future, but also that of Egypt and Caesar. As the conflict between Antony and Octavian escalated, Cleopatra remained at Antony's side, providing him with the resources he needed to wage war. The two were inseparable, and Cleopatra's role in the coming conflict would prove to be critical. However, their alliance, while strong, would soon be tested by the might of Octavian forces and the relentless propaganda campaign that had turned much of the Roman world against them. Cleopatra and Antony's relationship was one of the most iconic and controversial in ancient history. Their love affair, combined with their political ambitions, reshaped the power dynamics of the ancient Mediterranean and set the stage for the dramatic events that would follow as the world watched. Cleopatra and Antony prepared to face Octavian in a battle that would determine the fate of Egypt, Rome, and their own legacies. Part 7. The alliance between Egypt and Rome. As Cleopatra and Mark Antony's relationship deepened in the years following their fateful meeting in Tarsus. Their alliance reshaped the political landscape of the Mediterranean world. By 34 BCE, their partnership had reached its peak, marked by the grand ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria, which publicly declared their ambitions to unite the Eastern Mediterranean under their rule. However, this alliance would not go unchallenged. The Roman world, particularly Octavian Caesar's adopted heir, viewed the growing power of Cleopatra and Antony as a direct threat to Roman authority. The Donations of Alexandria were a bold and audacious move by Antony and Cleopatra. In this ceremony, which took place in Alexandria, the couple presented themselves and their children as the rulers of the Eastern Mediterranean. A symbolic division of the Roman Empire that was intended to elevate Cleopatra's dynasty Antony officially declared Cleopatra the Queen of Kings, giving her and their children dominion over territories such as Cyprus, Crete, Syria, and parts of Asia Minor, most significantly Caesarion. Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar was proclaimed King of Kings and was presented as the rightful heir to both Egypt and Rome. The political implication of the donations was staggering. Antony's public recognition of Caesarion as Julius Caesar's son and heir directly challenged the legitimacy of Octavian Caesar's adopted son and heir in Rome. This act effectively positioned Caesarion, a half-Egyptian child, as a rival to Octavian's claim to power. The Roman elite, who had already been suspicious of Antony's relationship with Cleopatra, now saw this as an open act of defiance against Roman authority. For Cleopatra, the donations of Alexandria represented the culmination of her long-standing ambitions for Egypt and her son. From the moment Caesarion was born, Cleopatra had envisioned a future in which he would rule not only Egypt, but also inherit his father's legacy in Rome. The ceremony was not just a display of wealth and power, but also a declaration that Cleopatra and Antony intended to create a new world order, one in which their dynasty would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean. However, Cleopatra's grand vision for the future was immediately met with fierce opposition from Octavian in Rome. Octavian used the donations as further evidence that Antony had abandoned his Roman roots and was now completely under Cleopatra's influence. Octavian, his propaganda machine, which had already been working tirelessly to paint Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign queen, seized on this opportunity to discredit both Antony and Cleopatra in the eyes of the Roman public. Octavian was a master of propaganda, and he framed the donations as a betrayal of Rome's values. He accused Antony of giving away Roman territories to a foreign queen and her children, an act that played into Roman fears of foreign domination and the erosion of the Republic. Octavian also stoked concerns that Cleopatra intended to establish a Hellenistic monarchy in the Eastern Mediterranean with herself, and Caesarion at its head, effectively reducing Rome's influence in the region. In addition to his propaganda campaign, Octavian took direct political action against Antony and Cleopatra. In 32, he persuaded the Roman Senate to formally declare war on Cleopatra. The war was not officially framed as a conflict between Antony and Octavian, as Octavian was careful to present Antony as a victim of Cleopatra's manipulation. Instead, the Senate declared war on Cleopatra, portraying her as a foreign enemy of Rome who had snared one of its leaders. This declaration of war allowed Octavian to mobilize Roman resources against Egypt while keeping the conflict framed as a defense of Roman sovereignty. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, recognized the growing threat posed by Octavian and began preparing Egypt for war. She knew that Antony's forces combined with Egypt's wealth and military resources would be crucial in the coming conflict. Cleopatra oversaw the construction of a powerful fleet, as control of the Mediterranean would be essential in the battle against Octavian's forces. Egypt's navy, which had long been a formidable presence in the region, was expanded and modernized under Cleopatra's direction. Antony, meanwhile, gathered his Roman legions and prepared for a showdown with Octavian, despite the growing tensions, and still had many supporters in Rome and the eastern provinces, and his army was one of the largest in the Roman world. However, the cracks in Antony's alliance with Rome were beginning to show. Many of Antony's supporters were uncomfortable with his close relationship with Cleopatra and the increasing influence she wielded over him. These concerns, combined with Octavian's propaganda, caused some of Antony's allies to defect to Octavian's side, further weakening Anon's position. The final confrontation between Antony, Cleopatra, and Octavian came in 31 at the Battle of Actium. This decisive naval battle fought off the coast of Greece would determine the fate of the Mediterranean. Both sides knew that control of the sea was critical, as it would allow the victor to dominate the entire region. Cleopatra's fleet, one of the largest and most formidable in the Mediterranean, played a central role in the battle. As the battle began, it quickly became clear that Octavian's forces, commanded by his brilliant general Agria, were better organized and more strategically prepared. Despite Antony, his large army and fleet, Octavian's navy gained the upper hand early on Cleopatra, who had brought her fleet to support. Antony found herself in a difficult position as the battle turned against them. Cleopatra made the fateful decision to draw her ships from the fight and retreat to Egypt. Antony, upon seeing Cleopatra's retreat, abandoned the battle and followed her, leaving his forces leaderless. The retreat from Actium was a disastrous blow to Antony and Cleopatra. Its cause their forces were decimated and their political and military support collapsed in the wake of their defeat. Octavian's victory at Actium marked the beginning of the end for Antony and Cleopatra. With their fleet destroyed and their armies in disarray, they fled back to Alexandria to prepare for the inevitable Roman invasion back in Alexandria. Antony and Cleopatra faced the reality that their dream of ruling the Eastern Mediterranean was now over. Antony, deeply shaken by the defeat at Actium, fell into despair. His relationship with Cleopatra, once a source of strength and ambition, began to unravel. As the two faced the consequences of their failed alliance, Antony's remaining supporters abandoned him, and many of Egypt's allies also turned against Cleopatra, recognizing that Octavian's victory was now inevitable. Cleopatra, however, refused to give up even in the face of overwhelming odds. She began fortifying Alexandria and preparing for a final stand against Octavian. She reached out to potential allies in the east, hoping to gather enough support to launch a counterattack, but it was clear that Octavian's forces were too strong. Cleopatra's hopes for saving her kingdom and her son's future were rapidly slipping away as Octavian's army approached Alexandria. Antony made one last attempt to rally his remaining forces. However, his efforts were in vain. Many of his soldiers, recognizing the futility of their situation, defected to Octavian's side. Antony, heartbroken by the collapse of his once powerful army and the loss of his political ambitions, fell on his sword in a final act of despair. According to legend, Antony died in Cleopatra's arms, a tragic end to their once great alliance with Antony dead. Cleopatra knew that her own fate, as well as that of Egypt, now lay in Octavian's hands. Octavian entered Alexandria in 30, and Cleopatra attempted to negotiate with him. She hoped to secure her son Caesarion safety and perhaps even preserve some degree of autonomy for Egypt. However, Octavian had no intention of allowing Cleopatra or Caesarion to survive as potential threats to his rule. He planned to take Cleopatra back to Rome as a captive, where she would be paraded in his triumph as a symbol of his victory over Egypt. Cleopatra, ever the master of strategy, knew that her capture would mean humiliation and defeat. She refused to allow herself to be displayed as a trophy of war in Octavian's triumph. In one final act of defiance, Cleopatra took her own life, reportedly by allowing an asp, a venomous snake, to bite her. The exact circumstances of her death remain shrouded in mystery. But ancient sources agree that Cleopatra died on her own terms, refusing to be taken as a captive by Rome. With Cleopatra's death, the last queen of Egypt was gone, and the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end. Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire, and Octavian, now Augustus, became the first emperor of Rome. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son and the last hope for the continuation of her dynasty, was captured and executed by Octavian's orders. Cleopatra's dream of a united Egypt and Rome with Caesarion as its ruler died with her. Part 8. The propaganda war against Cleopatra. As Cleopatra's death and Mark Antony's relationship deepened, and their political power in The Eastern Mediterranean grew a powerful and coordinated propaganda campaign against them took shape in Rome, led by Octavian. This campaign played a crucial role in turning the Roman people against Antony and Cleopatra, framing their alliance as a direct threat to Rome's traditional values and governance. This propaganda war was not just about politics. It was also deeply personal, as Octavian sought to undermine Antony's legitimacy as a Roman leader, while portraying Cleopatra as a manipulative foreign queen who had seduced Antony into betraying his own people. The seeds of this propaganda campaign were stubborn shortly after the donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE, when Antony publicly recognized Caesarion as Julius Caesar, son and heir for Octavian, who had been named Caesar's adopted son and heir. This was a direct challenge to his authority. The implications of Antony's actions were clear if Caesarion was officially recognized as Caesar is true. Ere Octavian's own position would be weakened. Octavian wasted no time in using this act to rally support against Antony and Cleopatra. In his portrayal of Antony, Octavian sought to distance him from his Roman identity, painting him as a man who had fallen under the corrupting influence of Cleopatra and Egypt in Octavian's narrative. Antony was no longer a noble Roman general, but a weak-willed man who had been seduced by a foreign queen and her lavish lifestyle. Octavian supporters in the Roman Senate and media spread rumors that Antony had become Egyptianizing the values of Rome in favor of Eastern decadence. This image of Antony as a man who had lost his Roman virtues was central to Octavian's campaign to the Roman public. The idea of Antony, once a celebrated general, forsaking his Roman identity was alarming. Roman society prided itself on discipline, frugality, and martial valor, all qualities that Antony had once embodied. However, through Octavian propaganda, Antony was now depicted as a man who had traded these virtues for the luxuries of Egypt, indulging in a life of heathenism alongside Cleopatra. Roman culture had long held a suspicion of Eastern monarchies, viewing them as decadent and morally corrupt. And Octavian tapped into this fear to discredit Antony. Cleopatra, meanwhile, was the central figure in Octavian's propaganda efforts. She was portrayed as the ultimate foreign seductress, a woman who used her beauty and cunning to manipulate men into doing her bidding. Octavian's propagandists drew on deeply ingrained Roman prejudices against women in power and foreign rulers, painting Cleopatra as an embodiment of both. Roman historians like Cassius Dio and Plutarch, writing in later years, reflected these views, describing Cleopatra as a dangerous and manipulative figure who had bewitched not only Antony, but also Julius Caesar before him. In this propaganda war, Cleopatra's intelligence, political savvy, and ambition were recast as negative traits. Rather than being admired for her abilities as a ruler, Cleopatra was depicted as a woman who used the skills to undermine Roman power. The idea that Cleopatra sought to establish an empire with herself and her son Caesarion as its rulers played into Roman fears of monarchy and foreign domination. Octavian's propaganda painted Cleopatra not just as a personal threat to Antony, but as a threat to the Roman Republic itself. One of the most powerful pieces of propaganda that Octavian used against Cleopatra and Antony was the accusation that they intended to move the capital of the Roman Empire to Alexandria. This idea was deeply unsettling to the Roman people, who saw Rome as the eternal and rightful center of the Mediterranean world. The notion that Antony, under Cleopatra's influence, would abandon Rome in favor of an Egyptian capital was framed as the ultimate betrayal. This narrative suggested that Antony was no longer loyal to Rome, but had become a puppet of Cleopatra, willing to sacrifice Roman sovereignty for her ambitions. Octavian also attacked the public spectacle of the donations of Alexandria, using it as evidence that Antony had ceded control of Roman territories to Cleopatra and her children. He accused Antony of giving away Roman lands to a foreign queen, an act that was seen as both dishonorable and treasonous in reality. The territories that Antony granted Cleopatra were largely symbolic, and the lands were already under his control as part of his eastern provinces. However, Octavian's framing of this act resonated with the Roman public, many of whom viewed Cleopatra's growing power. With suspicion, the propaganda against Cleopatra was not just about politics, it also had a deeply personal dimension. Octavian's sister Octavia had been married to Mark Antony as part of a political alliance between the two men, but Antony's abandonment of Octavia for Cleopatra became a key point in Octavian's campaign. Roman society valued the institution of marriage and the role of the Roman matron, and Octavia was widely regarded as the epitome of Roman womanhood. Loyal, modest, and dutiful Octavian portrayed Antony's rejection of Octavia as a betrayal of traditional Roman family values, contrasting Octavia's virtues with Cleopatra's supposed seductiveness and moral corruption. Octavian's portrayal of Cleopatra as a manipulative and dangerous foreign queen was effective in shaping public opinion. Cleopatra became a symbol of everything that Rome feared about the East: its perceived decadence, its absolute monarchies, and its challenge to Roman republicanism. The idea that Antony had fallen under Cleopatra's spell and was now working to establish a foreign dynasty over Rome struck at the heart of Roman anxieties about power, gender, and foreign influence. In contrast to Antony's increasingly tarnished reputation, Octavian worked to present himself as the true defender of Roman values. He positioned himself as a man of discipline, frugality, and loyalty to the Roman state. Octavian supporters emphasized his role as Julius Caesar's rightful heir and painted him as a man who would restore order to Rome after years of civil war. The contrast between Octavian's image as the embodiment of Roman virtue and Antony's portrayal as a man who had abandoned Rome in favor of Cleopatra was a powerful narrative that resonated with the Roman people. Octavian's propaganda campaign culminated in a series of public speeches and declarations that condemned Antony and Cleopatra as enemies of the state, by framing the conflict as a war not between Octavian and Antony, but between Rome and Cleopatra. Octavian was able to rally support for his cause. In 32, the Roman Senate formally declared war on Cleopatra, not on Antony. This decision allowed Octavian to present the conflict as a defense of Rome against a foreign threat, rather than a continuation of the civil wars that had plagued the Republic for decades. The declaration of war against Cleopatra also allowed Octavian to avoid appearing as though he were fighting a fellow Roman by focusing the conflict on Cleopatra. Octavian could sidestep the uncomfortable reality that he was engaging in a power struggle with Antony, who was still seen by many as a legitimate Roman leader. This framing of the war as a conflict between Rome and Egypt, between the values of the Republic and the decadence of the East, was a masterstroke of political strategy. Cleopatra, for her part, was well aware of the propaganda campaign being waged against her. She understood that Octavian's portrayal of her as a dangerous foreign queen was shaping Roman public opinion, and that her position was becoming increasingly precarious. Nevertheless, Cleopatra remained determined to protect her kingdom and her son's future. She continued to build up Egypt's defenses, particularly its navy, in preparation for the inevitable conflict with Octavian's forces in the years leading up to the final confrontation. Cleopatra and Antony maintained a lavish and opulent court in Alexandria, which only added fuel to Octavian's propaganda efforts. Stories of their luxurious lifestyle and extravagant feasts circulated in Rome, reinforcing the image of Antony and Cleopatra as out-of-touch rulers who had abandoned Roman values. These accounts, whether true or exaggerated, played into the narrative that Octavian was carefully constructing, that Antony and Cleopatra represented a corrupt and foreign threat to the Republic, as the propaganda war raged on the stage was set for the final military confrontation between Octavian's forces and those of Antony. And Cleopatra, the Battle of Actium fought in 31 BC, would determine the outcome of this long-running conflict. But before the swords were drawn and the ships engaged, the real battle had already been fought in the hearts and minds of the Roman people, where Octavian's propaganda had successfully turned the tide. Against Antony and Cleopatra Part 9, the Battle of Actium by 31, the tension between Octavian and the alliance of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony had reached its breaking point. The propaganda war orchestrated by Octavian had successfully turned much of the Roman populace against Antony, portraying him as a Roman who had abandoned his homeland for the luxuries of Egypt, all under the seductive influence of Cleopatra. However, the ultimate resolution would not come through words, but through one of the most famous naval battles in history, the Battle of Actium. The conflict between Octavian and Antony was not simply a power struggle between two Roman generals. It was framed as a battle for the soul of the Roman Republic. For Octavian, the battle represented his opportunity to secure his position as the dominant ruler of Rome and eliminate any rivals for Cleopatra and Antony. The battle was a fight for survival, a last stand to preserve their political ambitions and defend Egypt's independence. Both sides knew that the outcome of the coming battle would determine the fate of not only Rome, but also Egypt. The lead-up to the Battle of Actium was marked by significant preparations on both sides. Cleopatra had spent years building up Egypt's navy, which was one of the largest and most formidable fleets in the Mediterranean. She had invested heavily in ships and resources, knowing that control of the sea would be essential in any confrontation with Rome. Antony, too, had marshaled a large fleet, and his forces were bolstered by legions of Roman soldiers who remained loyal to him together. Anne and Cleopatra commanded a vast armada, with their ships stationed along the western coast of Greece near the Gulf of Ambia. Octavian, meanwhile, had his own formidable navy commanded by his trusted general and Admiral Agrippa was a brilliant strategist known for his naval prowess and his ability to outmaneuver opponents on the open sea. Octavian's fleet, though smaller in number than Antony and Cleopatra, was highly disciplined and well prepared for the coming battle. In addition to his naval strength, Octavian's forces were well supplied thanks to Agrippa's earlier capture of several key ports, which had cut off Antony's supply lines and left his forces in a weakened state as the two fleets prepared for battle. Both sides understood the high stakes involved. Cleopatra and Antony were stationed with their fleet at Actium, a promontory on the western coast of Greece. Their strategy was to break through Octavian's naval blockade and escape to Egypt, where they could regroup and potentially launch a counter-offensive. However, Octavian's forces were positioned to prevent this escape, and they intended to force a decisive battle that would end the conflict once and for all. The night before the battle, tensions ran high in both camps. Antony's forces were demoralized, plagued by supply shortages and desertions. Many of Antony's Roman allies had disillusioned with his leadership and his close association with Cleopatra, whom they viewed as a foreign influence. Cleopatra, too, was keenly aware of the danger she faced, not just for herself, but for her son Caesarion and the future of Egypt. The stakes could not have been higher for the queen, who had invested everything in her alliance with Antony and her dream of a united Egypt. And Rome, under her rule, on the morning of September the 2nd, 31st, the battle began. The fleets of Octavian and Antony lined up against each other in the calm waters off the coast of Actium. Antony's fleet was composed of large, heavily armed ships, which he believed would give him the advantage in close combat. These ships were designed to and board enemy vessels, and Antony hoped to use their size and strength to overpower Octavian's smaller, faster ships. However, Octavian's fleet under the command of Agrippa had a different strategy. Agrippa's ships were more maneuverable and his plan was to use this speed to outflank and harass. Antony's larger vessels A.G. Agrippa also deployed ships equipped with catapults and ballistae which could hurl projectiles at Antony's fleet from a distance, further weakening their defenses before engaging in close combat as the two fleets clashed. It became clear that Agrippa's tactics were working despite their size. Antony's ships struggled to keep up with the more agile vessels of Octavian's fleet as the battle raged. Cleopatra's role in the conflict became critical. Cleopatra had brought her own fleet to Actium, stationed in the rear of Antony's armada. Her ships, while formidable, were intended more for transport and support than direct combat. Nevertheless, Cleopatra's presence at the battle was symbolic of the close political and personal alliance between her and Antony. The two had agreed that if the battle went poorly, they would attempt to flee back to Egypt, where they could regroup and continue the fight. As Agrippa's fleet began to gain the upper hand, a crucial moment occurred, sensing that the battle was turning against them. Cleopatra made the fateful decision to withdraw her fleet from the conflict. With little warning, Cleopatra's ships raised their sails and began to retreat from the battle, heading for the open sea. Antony, upon seeing Cleopatra's retreat, was thrown into confusion. Some accounts suggest that Antony may have misinterpreted Cleopatra's retreat as a signal to flee, while others indicate that he simply could not bear the thought of abandoning her. Whatever the reason, Antony made the impulsive decision to leave. The battle and follow Cleopatra-Antony's abandonment of the battle was a disaster for his forces. His fleet, now leading, quickly fell into disarray. Octavian's navy pressed the advantage, capturing or destroying many of Antony's ships. What had begun as a tightly contested battle ended in a rout with Antony's forces decisively defeated. The Battle of Actium was over, and Octavian had emerged victorious. The defeat marked the beginning of the end for Antony and Cleopatra, who had pinned their hopes on the battle as their last chance to turn the tide in their favor. As Cleopatra and Antony fled back to Egypt, their political and military support crumbled around them. The defeat at Actium shattered Antony's credibility among his Roman allies, many of whom had already grown disillusioned with his leadership. Cleopatra, too, found herself increasingly isolated. Egypt's political stability had long depended on its alliances. With Rome and with Octavian now firmly in control, Cleopatra's position as queen was more precarious than ever. Octavian wasted no time in capitalizing on his victory with the defeat of Antony's fleet. Octavian was now the undisputed leader of Rome, and he turned his attention to Egypt. Octavian's propaganda machine continued to portray Cleopatra as the main antagonist, framing the conflict as a war against a foreign queen who had sought to undermine Rome's power. With his fleet victorious, Octavian prepared to march on Alexandria, determined to bring an end to Cleopatra's reign and incorporate Egypt into the Roman Empire back in Alexandria. Cleopatra and Antony faced the grim reality of their defeat. Antony, devastated by the loss at Actium and the collapse of his political support, fell into despair. His once powerful army had been decimated, and his Roman allies had either defected to Octavian or abandoned him. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra, which had been built on mutual ambition and political necessity, began to fray under the weight of their defeat. Antony's final days were marked by a sense of hopelessness as he prepared for the inevitable arrival of Octavian's forces. Cleopatra, however, remained defiant. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, she began preparing Alexandria for a final stand against Octavian's invasion. She reached out to potential allies in the east, hoping to gather enough support to resist Octavian's forces. Cleopatra also fortified the city's defenses, building up her remaining naval and military strength in anticipation of the coming siege for Cleopatra. The fight was not just about her own survival, it was about protecting Egypt and her son Caesarion, who she still believed could one day inherit his father's legacy. The Battle of Actium was a turning point in ancient history. It marked the end of the Roman Republic, its era of civil wars, and paved the way for the rise of Octavian as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome for Cleopatra and Antony. The battle represented the collapse of their ambitions and the beginning of their tragic end. The defeat at Actium sealed their fate, and their once grand vision of a united empire between Egypt and Rome was shattered as Octavian prepared to march on Alexandria. Cleopatra's world was rapidly unraveling. The queen who had once commanded one of the most powerful and wealthy kingdoms in the Mediterranean now faced the prospect of total defeat and the end of a dynasty. Yet even in these final moments, Cleopatra's determination to protect her kingdom and her son's future would drive her actions, leading to a dramatic and defiant conclusion. Part 10. The fall of Alexandria after the crushing defeat of the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Cleopatra II and Mark Antony returned to Alexandria, knowing that the war was not yet over, but realizing that their hopes for victory were rapidly fading. The battle had shattered their naval forces and the morale of their soldiers and supporters was in tatters. The alliance between Cleopatra and Antony, which had once promised to reshape the ancient world, was now crumbling under the weight of their failure. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony faced the daunting reality of Octavian's impending invasion. Octavian, who had decisively won the Battle of Actium, was determined to finish what he had started. His propaganda campaign had successfully cast Antony and Cleopatra as enemies of Rome, and he now had the political support and military might needed to march on Egypt and bring an end to their reign. For Octavian, the conquest of Egypt was not only a personal victory but also a symbolic one. By defeating Cleopatra, he would be cementing his power as the ruler of Rome and eliminating the last vestiges of the Roman Republic's civil wars. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, knew that Alexandria's days were numbered. However, she was not ready to surrender. Cleopatra began fortifying the city's defenses, rallying her remaining forces and reaching out to potential allies. She still harbored some hope that help might arrive from distant Eastern allies, but the reality was that most of her former supporters had either defected to Octavian's side or were too weak to offer meaningful assistance. Nevertheless, Cleopatra refused to give up her main priority. Now was to protect her son Caesarion and secure his future as the legitimate heir to both Egypt and Rome. Antony, on the other hand, was falling into a deep depression. The defeat at Actium had broken his spirit, and he struggled to maintain the confidence of his remaining troops. Many of Antony's supporters had already abandoned him, and those who remained were disillusioned by his leadership. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra, which had once been a source of strength and ambition for both of them, was now strained. Their once shared vision of a united Egypt and Rome had crumbled, and the weight of their impending defeat was taking its toll on both of them as Octavian's forces advanced on Egypt. Antony made one last attempt to rally his troops. He called upon his remaining soldiers to prepare for a final stand against Octavian's legions, but his efforts were in vain. Many of Antony's soldiers were exhausted, demoralized, and unwilling to continue fighting. Knowing that Octavian's forces were far superior and that their chances of victory were slim, many of Antony's men defected to Octavian's side or simply deserted Antony. Once a celebrated Roman general found himself isolated and increasingly powerless as Octavian's army drew closer to Alexandria. Antony and Cleopatra made preparations for the city's defense. Cleopatra, ever resourceful, fortified the city and made sure that her fleet was ready to engage Octavian's forces if necessary. She continued to hope that some miracle or unexpected development might turn the tide in their favor. But she also knew that that time was running out. Octavian, his reputation as a skilled military strategist preceded him, and Cleopatra understood that the forces she and Antony could muster would be no match for Octavian's well-organized and disciplined army by the summer of 30 BC. Octavian had reached the outskirts of Alexandria Cleopatra, and Antony prepared for a final confrontation, but it quickly became clear that their defenses would not hold. Octavian's forces were too numerous, and the morale among Antony's troops was too low. As Octavian's legions began to encircle the city, Antony's remaining supporters either defected to Octavian or surrendered without a fight. Cleopatra's navy, once one of the most formidable in the Mediterranean, had been severely weakened after Actium, and the ships that remained were no match for Octavian's fleet, faced with the inevitability of defeat. Antony's despair deepened. He had attempted to mount a defense of the city, but his efforts were half-hearted, and he knew that their situation was hopeless in his final moments of desperation. Antony received false news that Cleopatra had taken her own life, devastated by the belief that Cleopatra was dead. Antony fell on his sword, a traditional Roman act of suicide, meant to preserve his honor, mortally wounded. Antony was carried to Cleopatra, who was still very much alive, and he died in her arms. This tragic scene marked the end of one of history's most famous romantic and political alliances. Cleopatra, now alone, faced the full force of Octavian's invasion with Antony dead and Alexandria under siege. Cleopatra, whose options were limited. Octavian, who had entered the city triumphantly, was eager to capture Cleopatra and bring her back to Rome. As part of his victory celebration, he planned to parade her through the streets of Rome as a symbol of his triumph over Egypt and as a final demonstration of his power. Cleopatra, however, had no intention of allowing herself to be taken as a captive or used as a political trophy. Cleopatra's immediate concern was the fate of her son Caesarion. She knew that Octavian would see Caesarion as a threat, given his lineage as the son of Julius Caesar. Cleopatra's dream had always been for Caesarion to inherit both Egypt and Rome. But now that dream was in ruins. In a last-ditch effort to protect her son, Cleopatra arranged for Caesarion to flee Egypt, hoping that he might find refuge in a distant land and survive Octavian's purge. However, her efforts would ultimately be in vain. Octavian determined to eliminate any potential. Rivals ordered the execution of Caesarion. The young boy who had been in Cleopatra's greatest hope for the future was captured and killed on Octavian's orders, marking the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty with Caesarian death. Cleopatra's vision of a united Egypt and Rome came to a tragic conclusion, the last remaining heir to Julius Caesar. Her legacy was gone, and Cleopatra was left with no choice but to confront her own fate, realizing that her defeat was complete and that she would soon be taken captive by Octavian. Cleopatra made one final decision: she would end her life on her own terms. Cleopatra had always been a proud and independent ruler, and she refused to allow herself to be humiliated by Octavian in his victory procession. According to ancient sources, Cleopatra chose to die by suicide, using the venom of an asp, a symbol of royalty in Egypt. The details of her death remained shrouded in mystery, but the act itself was a final gesture of defiance. Cleopatra would not be paraded as a captive. She would die as the last queen of Egypt. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end, and Egypt, once one of the most powerful and wealthy kingdoms in the ancient world, was absorbed into the Roman Empire. Octavian, now the undisputed ruler of Rome, took control of Egypt, as vast wealth and resources which would play a crucial role in his consolidation of power. Octavian would go on to become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, marking the beginning of the Roman Empire and the end of the Republic. The fall of Alexandria and the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra marked the conclusion of a tumultuous period in Roman and Egyptian history. For Cleopatra, her life had been defined by her relentless pursuit of power and her efforts to secure Egypt's independence in a world dominated by Rome. She had allied herself with some of the most powerful men of her time, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and had dreamed of a future where Egypt and Rome could be united under her rule. But in the end, the forces arrayed against her were too great, and her ambitions along with her dynasty were crushed under the weight of Roman expansion. However, Cleopatra's legacy would endure long after her death. She has remained one of the most iconic figures in history, symbolizing both the allure and the tragedy of power. As the last queen of Egypt, Cleopatra's reign represented the end of the ancient phonic tradition and the beginning of a new era dominated by Rome. Her intelligence, political acumen, and determination have been the subject of countless stories, plays, and films, ensuring that her legacy as a powerful and enigmatic ruler would never be forgotten. Part 11. Cleopatra's death as the siege of Alexandria drew to its inevitable conclusion. Cleopatra VII found herself facing the final days of her reign. Her life and the future of Egypt in the summer of 30, after the death of Mark Antony and the collapse of their forces, Cleopatra was left alone to confront Octavian. The ambitious queen, who had spent years entangled in the political affairs of Rome, knew that her only options now were either submission or death. For Cleopatra, submission was never an option following Antony's death. Cleopatra had one final task before her: to ensure that her beloved son Caesarion would not fall into the hands of Octavian. Cleopatra had placed all of her hopes for the future in Caesarion, seeing him as the legitimate heir to Julius Caesar and the potential ruler of a united Egypt and Rome. However, she knew that as long as Caesarion lived, he posed a direct threat to Octavian's authority. Octavian determined to eliminate any possible challenges to his claim, as Caesar's heir had already made it clear that Caesarian's survival was not an option in a last desperate move. Cleopatra arranged for Caesarion to flee Egypt, sending him south to the Red Sea, hoping he could escape to safety and perhaps rally support from distant allies. However, her efforts to protect her son would ultimately be in vain. Caesarian's escape plan was betrayed, and he was captured by Octavian's forces. Octavian, ruthless in his pursuit of power, ordered Caesarian execution. With his death, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to a tragic and irrevocable end. The dream of Cleopatra's lineage continuing in both Egypt and Rome was destroyed. Cleopatra's final days were filled with both sorrow and defiance. She knew that Octavian intended to bring her back to Rome as a captive to display her in his triumphal parade as a symbol of his victory over Egypt. This prospect was unbearable to Cleopatra. The idea of being paraded through the streets of Rome, humiliated in front of the Roman people, was an indignity. She could not accept. Cleopatra had ruled as a queen for decades, presenting herself as a living goddess and a powerful sovereign. She had fought to preserve Egypt's independence and her own status as a ruler to be reduced to a spectacle in Rome. Victory celebrations was something she would never allow, determined to die on her own terms. Cleopatra began making preparations for her death. According to ancient sources, Cleopatra sent a request to Octavian to meet with him in person. She likely hoped that she could negotiate some terms for herself or her children's future, but Octavian, ever the pragmatic politician, saw little reason to grant her any concessions. He visited Cleopatra in Alexandria, where the once great queen, now facing the of her reign, made one final appeal for mercy. However, Octavian remained cold and unmoved by her pleas. Cleopatra, understanding that there was no hope of mercy from Octavian, turned to her final act of defiance. She would choose how and when she would die, denying Octavian the satisfaction of taking her alive. According to some ancient accounts, Cleopatra had long planned for this moment, ensuring that she had access to the means to end her life. When the time came, the most famous version of Cleopatra's death involves the use of an asp, a venomous snake, whose bite could deliver a swift and relatively painless death, that was a symbol of royalty in ancient Egypt, and Cleopatra, his choice to use it in her death was both symbolic and practical. The exact details of Cleopatra's death remain the subject of debate among historians. The classical sources, including Plutarch, and cases to describe how Cleopatra, after receiving word that Octavian was about to seize her, took refuge in her tomb. There she dressed herself in her finest royal attire, preparing for her final moments as the Queen of Egypt. She arranged for the ESA to be brought to her in a basket of figs or some other container, and according to the accounts, she allowed the snake to bite her, ending her life in a final act of sovereignty over her fate. Other accounts suggest that Cleopatra may have used a different method of suicide, such as poison, which was more readily accessible to her. Regardless of the exact method, the message was clear: Cleopatra refused to be taken alive by her enemies. She chose to die as a queen on her own terms, rather than be reduced to a pawn in Octavian's victory over Egypt. With Cleopatra's death, the last remnants of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the ancient Egyptian phonic tradition came to an end. When Octavian's soldiers arrived at Cleopatra's tomb, they found her already dead, lying peacefully in her royal garments with the ASP by her side. Cleopatra's final act had deprived Octavian of the opportunity to parade her as a captive in Rome, but it also sealed her fate as one of history's most enigmatic and powerful figures. Her death was reported across the Mediterranean world, and in Rome it was seen as the final victory of Octavian over his last great rival in the aftermath of Cleopatra's death. Octavian moved swiftly to consolidate his control over Egypt. The once great kingdom, which had been ruled by the Ptolemies for nearly 3 centuries, was now a province of the Roman Empire. Egypt's vast wealth, particularly its grain production, became a critical asset to Rome, providing the resources needed to feed its growing population. And military Octavian's conquest of Egypt solidified his position as the most powerful man in the Roman world, and in 27 he would be declared Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, marking the beginning of the Roman Empire. Cleopatra's legacy, however, would endure long after her death as the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra's life and reign came to symbolize the end of an era. She was the last in a long line of pharaohs who had ruled Egypt for millennia, stretching back to the time of the pyramids. Her death marked the final chapter of the ancient Egyptian civilization as an independent power. From this point on, Egypt would be ruled by foreign powers, first by Rome, and later by Byzantium, the Arabs, the Ottomans, and the British. In the centuries that followed, Cleopatra became one of the most famous and romanticized figures in history. Her intelligence, political acumen, and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds ensured that she would be remembered not only as a ruler, but also as a symbol of the complexities of power in the Western imagination. Cleopatra became the archetype of the exotic and powerful queen, a figure whose beauty and allure were matched only by her ambition and cunning. However, beyond the myths and legends, Cleopatra was a capable and shrewd leader who navigated some of the most treacherous political waters of her time. In modern times, Cleopatra's legacy has been re-examined by scholars and historians who have sought to peel away the layers of Roman propaganda and understand her as a ruler in her own right. While much of what we know about Cleopatra comes from Roman sources, which were often hostile to her, recent studies have highlighted her achievements as a stateswoman, a diplomat, and a leader who sought to protect her kingdom. In a world dominated by Roman imperialism, Cleopatra's death marked the end of Egypt as an independent kingdom. But her life has continued to inspire generations of artists, writers, and thinkers, from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra to the countless films and novels that have portrayed her. Cleopatra's story remains a powerful testament to the allure and complexity of power, ambition, and legacy as the last queen of Egypt. Cleopatra's reign was a unique blend of Greek and Egyptian traditions, a bridge between the ancient and the classical worlds. Her life was a story of political intrigue, romance and tragedy, and her death ensured that she would remain a legendary figure for millennia to come. Part 12. Cleopatra's legacy. The death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE marked the end of an era, not only for Egypt, but also for the ancient world. Her passing closed the final chapter of the Pharaonic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for millennia, dating back to the earliest kings who built the pyramids. With her death, Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire, and the country's long-standing independence was permanently lost. But while Cleopatra's death brought an end to one of history's most enduring kingdoms, it also marked the beginning of a legacy that would stretch far beyond her lifetime. Cleopatra's legacy is multifaceted. As the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, she represented a unique convergence of Egyptian and Hellenistic culture. The tomes, originally Macedonian Greeks, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, CES blending their Greek heritage with the ancient traditions of Egypt. Cleopatra, however, took this cultural synthesis a step further. Unlike her predecessors, she embraced Egyptian customs and religion, presenting herself not only as a Hellenistic monarch, but also as the embodiment of the Egyptian goddess Isis. This dual identity allowed her to command the loyalty of both her Greek and Egyptian subjects, positioning herself as a ruler who transcended cultural divisions. One of Cleopatra's most significant legacies was her mastery of politics and diplomacy. Despite the image of Cleopatra as a seductive temptress that Roman propaganda promoted, she was in reality an astute and shrewd leader who navigated some of the most dangerous political waters of her time. Cleopatra ruled during a period when Rome was expanding its influence across the Mediterranean, and she understood that Egypt's survival depended on her ability to align herself with the right Roman leaders. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and Antony were not simply romantic relationships, but strategic partnerships that reflected Cleopatra's determination to protect Egypt's independence. Cleopatra's intelligence and education were also critical to her success. Fluent in multiple languages, including Greek, Egyptian, and Latin, Cleopatra was one of the most learned rulers of her time. She had been educated in Alexandria, one of the world's greatest centers of learning, and she was known for her deep knowledge of philosophy, politics, and science. Cleopatra's intellectual abilities allowed her to engage with the most powerful men of her time on equal terms, earning their respect not only for her beauty, but also for her sharp mind and political insight. Despite her considerable talents, Cleopatra's reign was defined by her struggle to maintain Egypt's independence. In a world increasingly dominated by Rome throughout her life, Cleopatra fought to preserve her kingdom's autonomy, using every tool at her disposal: diplomacy, military strategy, and political alliances. But ultimately, the forces arrayed against her were too great. Rome, under the leadership of Octavian, was on the rise, and Egypt's wealth and strategic importance made it an irresistible prize for the Roman Empire. Cleopatra's efforts to protect Egypt from Roman domination were heroic, but ultimately doomed. The nature of Cleopatra's death has also contributed to her enduring legacy. By choosing to take her own life rather than submit to the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as a captive, Cleopatra ensured that she would be remembered as a proud and defiant ruler who refused to be reduced to a political pawn. Her death by suicide, often depicted as a dramatic scene involving an asp, became a symbol of her sovereignty and control over her fate in taking her life. Cleopatra denied Octavian the final triumph over her, asserting her agency even in her last moments in the centuries following her death. Cleopatra's image was shaped by Roman propaganda and later Western interpretations. Octavian, who would go on to become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, worked to solidify his own legacy by discrediting Antony and Cleopatra. Roman historians, like Plutarch and Diocles, portrayed Cleopatra as a cunning and manipulative figure, emphasizing her supposed use of beauty and seduction to influence powerful men. This narrative, propagated by Rome's victors, persisted for centuries and influenced how subsequent generations viewed Cleopatra. In the Renaissance, interest in Cleopatra's story was revived, and she became a popular subject in literature, art, and drama. William Shakespeare's play Antony and Patra, written in the early 17th century, cemented her place in Western literary tradition. Shakespeare's portrayal of Cleopatra as a complex and passionate woman capable of both great love and great ambition helped to humanize her and counter some of the more one-dimensional depictions from earlier Roman accounts. In Shakespeare's play, Cleopatra is not just a manipulative seductress, but a deeply charismatic and tragic figure. Torn between love and power, artistic depictions of Cleopatra from the Renaissance through the 19th century often emphasized her beauty, exoticism, and romantic relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. These portrayals frequently reflected Western fantasies about the mysterious East, casting Cleopatra as an emblem of Orientalist allure and decadence. In paintings and sculptures, she was often depicted at the moment of her death, reclining in regal splendor as the ASP delivered its fatal bite, a powerful image of tragic beauty and doomed royalty. In the 20th century, Cleopatra's story became even more popular in popular culture, with numerous films, novels, and television series exploring her life and legacy. One of the most famous portrayals of Cleopatra came in the 1963 film Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor. The film, a Hollywood epic, further solidified Cleopatra's image as a glamorous and larger-than-life figure, but it also perpetuated many of the romanticized and sensationalized aspects of her story. While the film was a box office success, it did little to challenge the stereotypes that had long been associated with Cleopatra. In recent decades, scholars have worked to reassess Cleopatra's legacy, focusing more on her accomplishments as a ruler and less on the sensational aspects of her personal life. Historians now recognize that Cleopatra was a capable and intelligent leader who managed to rule one of the wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms in the Mediterranean during a period of intense political upheaval. Her ability to maintain Egypt's independence for as long as she did, despite the overwhelming power of Rome, speaks to her skill as a diplomat and strategist. Cleopatra's legacy also extends beyond her role as a political leader. She has become a symbol of feminine power and resilience, representing a woman who wielded authority in a male-dominated world in modern feminist interpretations. Cleopatra is often seen as a figure who challenged the norms of her time, asserting her right to rule and her independence in a world where women were typically confined to the private sphere. Her story resonates with contemporary audiences as an example of a powerful woman who refused to be defined by the men in her life at the same time. Cleopatra's legacy is also a cautionary tale about the complexities of power and ambition. Her alliance with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony allowed her to extend Egypt's influence and protect her kingdom from Roman annexation, but those same relationships ultimately tied her fate to Rome. In civil wars, Cleopatra's ambitions for her Caesarion reflected her desire to create a new world order in which Egypt and Rome would be united. But in the end, the dream was undone by the very forces she sought to control today. Cleopatra remains one of the most famous figures in world history. Her life and reign continue to captivate scholars, artists, and the public alike. She is a figure of both immense power and immense tragedy. a queen who fought to preserve her kingdom and her legacy in the face of overwhelming odds. Her story is one of love, ambition, and defiance, and her influence can still be felt in how we think about leadership, gender, and history. Cleopatra's life may have ended with her death in 30, but her legacy lives on, transcending time and place, as the last pharaoh of Egypt and one of the most influential women in history. Cleopatra's story is a reminder of the complexities of power and the enduring impact of those who wield it.